I didn't think much about it at the time. It was just there, part of the day, like the light coming through the window or the sound of the house settling in the afternoon. The television turned on, the same channel, the same familiar opening. Nothing about it felt important enough to question. It felt ordinary, predictable, safe in a way I didn't yet have words for. Back then, watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood wasn't an event. It didn't require excitement or preparation. It arrived quietly, at the same time, with the same calm rhythm, asking nothing from me except that I sit still for a while. I didn't know that stillness itself was part of what it was offering. The world outside the television often felt louder. Voices carried tension. Rooms held moods I didn't fully understand. There were things happening around me that didn't come with explanations meant for a child. But when that program started, everything seemed to soften, as if the noise stepped back just enough for me to breathe. I remember the pace more than anything else, how nothing rushed, how words were spoken carefully, with space between them, how silence was allowed to exist without being filled. At the time, I didn't recognize this as unusual. I assumed the world could always move this way if it wanted to. It never occurred to me that the calm I felt wasn't coming from me. I thought that was just how afternoons worked. That sense of safety didn't feel borrowed. It felt natural, like something that belonged to the room itself, rather than the screen in front of me. I didn't understand that consistency can be a form of protection, that showing up the same way, every time, can build trust without saying so. The routine wrapped itself around me quietly, teaching me that some parts of life could be relied on, even if others could not. Looking back now, I see how much of that mattered. But back then, I was just a child sitting on the floor or the couch, watching a man change his shoes and speak gently, unaware that something important was happening beneath the surface of that simplicity. I didn't think of it as learning. I didn't think of it as comfort. I certainly didn't think of it as protection. It was just something that played in the background while my life unfolded in ways I couldn't yet name. The memory feels small when I first touch it, almost insignificant. Just a television, a familiar voice, a half hour passing the way it always did. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, and yet, that quiet repetition was already doing its work. I didn't know then that this would become one of the places I would return to later, not physically, but emotionally, trying to understand how something so gentle could have held so much weight without ever announcing itself. I didn't think much about it at the time. It was just there, part of the day, like the light coming through the window, or the sound of the house settling in the afternoon. The television turned on, the same channel, the same familiar opening. Nothing about it felt important enough to question. It felt ordinary, predictable, safe in a way I didn't yet have words for. Back then, watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood wasn't an event. It didn't require excitement or preparation. It arrived quietly, at the same time, with the same calm rhythm, asking nothing from me except that I sit still for a while. I didn't know that stillness itself was part of what it was offering. The world outside the television often felt louder. Voices carried tension. Rooms held moods I didn't fully understand. There were things happening around me that didn't come with explanations meant for a child. But when that program started, everything seemed to soften, as if the noise stepped back just enough for me to breathe. I remember the pace more than anything else, how nothing rushed, how words were spoken carefully, with space between them, how silence was allowed to exist without being filled. At the time, I didn't recognize this as unusual. I assumed the world could always move this way if it wanted to. It never occurred to me that the calm I felt wasn't coming from me. I thought that was just how afternoons worked. That sense of safety didn't feel borrowed. It felt natural, like something that belonged to the room itself, rather than the screen in front of me. I didn't understand that consistency can be a form of protection, that showing up the same way, every time, can build trust without saying so. The routine wrapped itself around me quietly, teaching me that some parts of life could be relied on, even if others could not. Looking back now, I see how much of that mattered. But back then, I was just a child sitting on the floor or the couch, watching a man change his shoes and speak gently, unaware that something important was happening beneath the surface of that simplicity. I didn't think of it as learning. I didn't think of it as comfort. I certainly didn't think of it as protection. It was just something that played in the background while my life unfolded in ways I couldn't yet name. The memory feels small when I first touch it, almost insignificant. Just a television, a familiar voice, a half hour passing the way it always did. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. And yet, that quiet repetition was already doing its work. I didn't know then that this would become one of the places I would return to later. Not physically, but emotionally, trying to understand how something so gentle could have held so much weight without ever announcing itself. At that age, I didn't separate the program from the rest of the day. It blended into the afternoon the same way familiar sounds did, unnoticed until they were gone. The room stayed the same, the furniture didn't move, and yet something subtle shifted the moment it began. The air felt calmer, even if I couldn't explain why. I remember sitting close to the television, sometimes cross-legged on the floor, sometimes leaning against the couch, letting the rhythm of his voice settle into me. It wasn't exciting, it didn't demand laughter or surprise. It asked for attention in a quieter way, one that felt more like being seen than being entertained. Around me life continued. Doors opened and closed. Conversations happened in other rooms. I didn't always understand their tone, but I felt them. There were days when the house carried an edge I couldn't name, a heaviness that made me feel smaller without knowing why. During those moments, that half hour felt like stepping into a different climate. What struck me later was how intentional everything was. The way he spoke directly, but never loudly. The way he took his time, as if time itself was something to be respected. Back then, I thought all adults could choose to move that way if they wanted. I didn't yet understand how rare that gentleness actually was. Nothing about the show tried to distract me from my feelings. It didn't rush to make things better. It didn't pretend everything was fine. It simply acknowledged that feelings existed, and that they were allowed. At the time, I didn't recognize how powerful that permission was. I absorbed that acceptance without noticing. It settled somewhere beneath conscious thought, becoming part of how I understood myself. Even when the program ended and the screen changed, something stayed with me, like a quiet afterimage that lingered longer than expected. I never talked about it. I didn't say that it made me feel safer or calmer. I didn't know that it did. It felt too normal to mention, too woven into the day to be singled out. I assumed everyone felt this way when they watched it. Years later, I would realize how few spaces offered that kind of calm, how unusual it was to be addressed without pressure, without expectation, without the need to perform. But at the time, it simply felt like part of growing up, as ordinary as the furniture in the room. I didn't understand that protection doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like consistency, like a voice that doesn't change, like a presence that shows up exactly the same way, no matter what else is happening around it. That understanding came much later. Back then, all I knew was that when the program played, the world felt a little less sharp, and I didn't question it. As the days went on, that half hour became something my body recognized before my mind did. I didn't mark it on a schedule or count down the minutes, but I felt when it was close. The day seemed to slow just a little, as if it knew what was coming, as if it was making room without being asked. I didn't always understand what he was talking about. Some words passed over me. Some ideas landed later than they were meant to. But the tone reached me anyway. The steadiness, the care, the sense that nothing needed to be rushed or fixed immediately. That alone felt like enough. There were moments when the house felt unpredictable, when voices rose unexpectedly, when moods shifted without warning. I didn't know the reasons, only the effects. My body learned to stay alert during those times, even when nothing was directly wrong. Then the program would start, and that alertness softened. It wasn't that the show solved anything. It didn't change what was happening outside the screen. It didn't erase tension or make problems disappear. What it did was offer a place where none of that had to be addressed right away. A pause, a breath, a reminder that gentleness existed somewhere. I think now about how rare that is for a child, to be spoken to without being talked down to be acknowledged without being overwhelmed, to be told, quietly and consistently, that feelings are acceptable, and that being who you are is enough. At the time, I just felt calmer. I didn't know why. I remember how slowly everything moved. The way actions were deliberate, never hurried. The way silence wasn't treated as a mistake. That pace gave my thoughts room to settle, even if I didn't yet have the language to describe what was happening inside me. When the episode ended, the television didn't turn off right away. The screen changed, the sound shifted, and the house resumed its usual rhythm. but I carried something with me as I stood up and moved on. A softness that lasted longer than the program itself. I didn't associate that feeling with safety then. I didn't think of it as refuge. I assumed that calm was just something that came and went naturally. I didn't realize it was being offered intentionally, or that I was learning something about how the world could feel. Looking back, I see how easily I trusted that presence, how quickly it became familiar, how deeply it settled into me without effort. It didn't need excitement to hold my attention. It didn't need volume to feel important. I didn't know it then, but something was being built during those afternoons, quietly, carefully, a sense that not all spaces were demanding, and not all voices were sharp, a sense that would stay with me long after the television was turned off. I didn't realize how much I relied on that calm until it wasn't there one afternoon. The routine shifted slightly, the timing changed, or something interrupted it, and the space it usually filled felt strangely exposed. I remember noticing the difference in my body before I understood it in my mind, a subtle tension returning without its usual release. On days when the program did play, I settled into it without ceremony. I didn't announce that I was watching. I didn't treat it as special. I simply allowed it to happen, the way you allow something that has never let you down. That trust formed quietly, built not on excitement, but on repetition. The gestures mattered more than I knew. The way he moved slowly, deliberately. The way he spoke as if he had all the time in the world. The way nothing felt accidental. As a child, I didn't analyze these things. I absorbed them. They became part of how I learned to listen and wait. I think now about how different that was from most of what surrounded me. The world outside the screen moved faster, demanded quicker reactions, offered fewer explanations. It taught me to adapt, to stay aware, to respond. Inside that half hour, none of that was required. I could simply exist. There were times when I didn't even watch closely. I played quietly nearby, half listening, half drifting. Even then, the presence worked. The calm didn't require full attention to be effective. It wrapped around the room, filling spaces I hadn't known needed filling. I didn't have language for protection back then. I didn't know that children need environments that don't constantly ask them to be something. I just knew that I felt different when it was on. Lighter, less guarded, as if I didn't need to be ready for anything. Looking back, I understand that consistency can create safety without instruction. That being greeted the same way, spoken to the same way, week after week, teaches trust more effectively than reassurance ever could. At the time, it just felt dependable. I never thought about who was on the other side of the screen. I didn't imagine him as a person with a life beyond that space. He existed exactly where and how I needed him to. That simplicity allowed the message to land without distraction. As the years passed, I carried that rhythm with me without realizing it. The memory stayed dormant, unexamined, waiting for a time when it would make sense. I didn't know yet that I would need to return to it, searching for the source of a calm I once took for granted. Back then, all I knew was that when that familiar voice filled the room, something inside me settled, and I trusted that feeling without asking why. As I grew a little older, I stopped thinking about the program as something meant just for me. It became background, something familiar that played while life continued to change around it. I didn't sit as close anymore. I didn't watch every movement with the same focus. But even as my attention drifted, the effect remained. The world began to ask more questions of me then. Expectations slowly appeared, even if they weren't spoken out loud. I became more aware of moods, of unspoken rules, of the way adults carried worries they didn't explain. I learned to read rooms before entering them, to sense what kind of day it was going to be. During that time, the program stayed exactly the same. It didn't adjust its tone to match the world outside. It didn't grow louder or faster. It didn't demand that I keep up. That consistency stood in quiet contrast to everything else that seemed to be shifting. I didn't recognize how rare that was. Most things change when you do. Most spaces expect you to adapt. That half hour did not. It met me where I was, without comment, without expectation. I didn't know how much that mattered, only that it felt familiar in a way few other things did. There were days when I didn't feel particularly safe, though I wouldn't have used that word at the time. I just felt unsettled, unsure of what to expect next. On those days the calm felt heavier, more noticeable, as if it was doing more work than usual. I didn't connect that feeling to protection yet. I thought of it as comfort. something mild and pleasant. I didn't understand that comfort can be a form of stability, and that stability can quietly shape how a person learns to exist in the world. As the years passed, I moved on to other shows, other interests, other distractions. That one faded from daily life without ceremony. I didn't mark its absence. I didn't miss it right away. It simply stopped being part of my routine, replaced by things that felt more age-appropriate. But the calm didn't disappear completely. It stayed somewhere beneath the surface, influencing how I responded to stress, how I spoke to myself, how I expected to be treated. I carried it without knowing where it came from. I didn't think about the program again for a long time. It lived quietly in memory, unexamined, waiting for the moment when I would finally understand what it had given me. At the time, I just kept growing, unaware that something gentle and steady had helped me do so. Time moved forward the way it always does, quietly and without asking for permission. Childhood gave way to adolescence, and with it came new distractions, new pressures, new ways of understanding the world. The calm that once felt automatic became harder to find, though I didn't yet realize I was missing it. I learned how to stay busy, how to fill silence, how to keep moving so nothing had to be felt for too long. The world rewarded that behavior, praised it even. Speed became normal, noise became familiar. Stillness began to feel strange, almost suspicious. There were moments when I felt overwhelmed, without knowing why. Nothing dramatic was happening, yet something inside me stayed tense, alert, as if waiting for a problem that hadn't arrived yet. I didn't connect that feeling to anything specific. I assumed it was just part of growing up. Occasionally, I would stumble across something that felt familiar in an unexpected way. A voice that moved slowly, a pause that wasn't rushed, a conversation that allowed silence. Those moments stood out, not because they were extraordinary, but because they reminded my body of something it already knew. I didn't have a name for that recognition. I just knew it felt grounding, like standing on solid ground after walking too long on uneven surfaces. I didn't question it. I didn't trace it back. I let it pass, unaware of its origin. The memory of those afternoons remained distant, almost abstract. I remembered the show, but not its effect. I could recall scenes and sounds, but not the role they had played. It felt like a closed chapter, something completed and left behind. Life continued to speed up. Responsibilities multiplied. Attention fractured. Calm became something scheduled rather than experienced naturally. I adapted, as people do, without noticing what adaptation was costing me. I didn't know then that I was carrying an imprint of a slower rhythm, that my body remembered a pace that my life no longer allowed, that the discomfort I felt in constant motion was connected to something I had once known intimately. The protection I had felt as a child didn't vanish. It became buried under layers of urgency and expectation, quietly waiting, much like it always had, for the moment when I would finally stop long enough to recognize it. That moment hadn't arrived yet, but it was getting closer, even if I couldn't feel it coming. That recognition came slowly, not as a realization but as a feeling I couldn't quite place. I found myself drawn to moments that moved gently, to people who spoke without urgency, to spaces where nothing demanded immediate response. I didn't know why those moments felt necessary. I only knew that I breathed differently inside them. There were times when I sought quiet, without understanding what I was looking for. I turned down noise instinctively. I lingered in stillness longer than seemed practical. It wasn't intentional. It felt like following a memory my body remembered but my mind had forgotten. When stress built without a clear source, I assumed it was normal. Everyone seemed overwhelmed. Everyone seemed busy. I told myself that this was just how life worked now. That calm was something you earned later, if at all. I didn't yet question that belief, but every so often, something small would break through. A familiar tone, a deliberate pause, a kindness offered without performance. In those moments, something in me softened immediately, the way it had years before. Sitting on the floor in front of the television, I began to wonder why that softness felt so rare. Why it felt like relief instead of baseline. Why my nervous system responded so strongly to gentleness, as if it had been waiting for it. The question stayed with me, unresolved but persistent. I didn't connect it to childhood right away. I assumed it had more to do with adulthood, with fatigue, with responsibility. I didn't realize I was missing something older, something foundational, something that had shaped me long before I could explain it. The world encouraged constant engagement, faster responses, quicker decisions, continuous input. I kept up because that was what was expected. Still, the sense that something essential was being crowded out refused to leave me alone. I started to pay attention to what calmed me instead of what entertained me. The difference mattered. Entertainment distracted, calm restored. That distinction felt important, even if I couldn't yet articulate why. Slowly, without planning to, I began tracing that feeling backward, following it through memory, through habit, through sensation, until it led me somewhere familiar and distant at the same time. It led me back to a small room, a steady voice, and a pace of life that once taught me how to feel safe without ever telling me it was doing so. When I finally allowed myself to linger on that memory, it opened with surprising clarity. I could see the room again, not as a place frozen in time, but as it felt. The way the light sat in the afternoon, the way the television hummed softly before the program began, the way my body settled without instruction. I realized then that what I had felt wasn't just calm, it was regulation, a nervous system being guided gently back into balance, again and again, without me knowing that's what was happening. That half hour had been teaching my body how to rest in the presence of another. As a child, I didn't have words for emotional safety. I only knew how things felt. And what I felt during those moments was a sense of being addressed without demand, acknowledged without pressure. That experience planted something deep and steady inside me. I began to understand why those memories carried weight now. They weren't about nostalgia alone. They were about a blueprint, a model of how interaction could feel when it was rooted in patience and care. Something my adult life had rarely offered in such a consistent way. It struck me how quietly that influence had worked. No dramatic lessons, no warnings, no urgency, just repetition, just showing up the same way, again and again, until safety became familiar rather than exceptional. I wondered how many children had been absorbing the same thing without realizing it, sitting in different rooms, in different homes, feeling that same settling in their bodies without knowing its name. The thought made the memory feel larger, more collective. That understanding brought a mix of gratitude and grief. Gratitude for having received something so gentle. Grief for not knowing it at the time, for not recognizing its importance until it was gone. The calm had been real, but invisible. I realized then that the program hadn't just been something I watched. It had been something I experienced physically, emotionally, quietly shaping how my system learned to exist in the world. That realization reframed so much of what I had felt later in life. The longing for slowness, the discomfort with constant urgency, the relief found in gentle spaces, all of it traced back to those afternoons. I didn't feel sadness in that moment. I felt understanding, a sense of pieces aligning. The calm I had been searching for wasn't new, it was remembered. With that understanding came a gentler view of my own past. I stopped seeing those afternoons as something passive or unimportant. I began to recognize them as moments of quiet support, offered without conditions, without expectations, without needing anything in return. That kind of support leaves a mark, even when it goes unnoticed at the time. I thought about how often children are asked to adapt to environments that aren't built for them. How quickly they learn to adjust, to stay quiet, to stay alert, to sense what is required before being told. In that context, having a place that asked nothing felt extraordinary, even if it appeared ordinary. The program never pretended to replace anything in my life. It didn't offer escape in a dramatic way. It simply created a small island of calm where my system could rest. That rest mattered more than I knew, especially on days when the rest of the world felt unpredictable. I realized that protection doesn't always come from removing danger. Sometimes it comes from offering consistency, from showing what safety feels like so the body can recognize it later. Those lessons don't announce themselves. They settle quietly and wait. As an adult, I could see how that early experience had shaped my tolerance for chaos. I didn't crave intensity the way some people did. I sought steadiness. I valued gentleness. I trusted slow connection over fast excitement, even when I couldn't explain why. There were moments when I questioned that preference. The world often celebrates speed, ambition, constant motion. Calm can be mistaken for weakness. Slowness can be misread as disengagement. For a long time, I wondered if something was wrong with me for wanting less noise. Remembering those afternoons helped me understand that nothing was wrong. I had simply learned a different rhythm early on. a rhythm that valued presence over performance, patience over urgency, a rhythm that had been modeled, not taught. That realization brought a sense of permission. Permission to honor what felt regulating, instead of forcing myself to adapt to constant intensity. Permission to choose environments that felt safe, even if they weren't impressive or productive. The memory of that steady voice and that unhurried pace became something I could return to internally, not as nostalgia, but as guidance, a reminder of what calm feels like in the body. And in that remembering, I found something unexpected, a sense that what once protected me could still guide me, even now, long after the television had gone dark. As I carried that understanding forward, I began to notice how often calm had been missing from the spaces I moved through. Conversations rushed toward conclusions. Silence felt awkward, something to fill quickly. Even moments meant for rest carried an undercurrent of urgency, as if time itself were watching. I started to see how unusual it had been to grow up with a voice that never hurried me, a presence that allowed pauses without interpreting them as problems. That early experience had set a quiet standard, one that much of the adult world failed to meet. I hadn't known I was comparing, but my body had been all along. There were times when I tried to recreate that feeling without realizing it. I slowed my speech, I softened my tone, I gave people space to finish their thoughts. It wasn't something I consciously decided. It felt instinctive, as though I were repeating a language learned long ago. I thought about how easily calm can be overlooked because it doesn't demand attention. It doesn't insist on being noticed. It simply exists, steady and available. That made me realize how fragile it can be in a culture that rewards volume and speed over presence. The older I became, the more I appreciated how radical that gentleness had been. Speaking softly in a loud world, taking time in a culture obsessed with efficiency, treating emotions as something to acknowledge rather than manage away. Those choices felt small, but their impact was lasting. I recognized how often I gravitated toward people who carried that same steadiness, not because they were perfect or wise, but because they felt safe. Being around them allowed my body to relax in familiar ways, echoing something I had learned early without knowing it. That realization reshaped how I understood connection. I stopped chasing intensity and began valuing consistency. I paid attention to how interactions made me feel after they ended, not just during them. Calm left something behind. Urgency rarely did. Looking back, it made sense that a children's program could leave such a deep impression. Children learn through feeling long before they learn through explanation. What I had absorbed wasn't information. It was an experience of being addressed gently and consistently. I understood then that protection doesn't always look like shielding someone from harm. Sometimes it looks like teaching them what safety feels like, so they can recognize it later. That lesson had stayed with me, even when I forgot where it came from. The memory of those afternoons no longer felt distant. It felt active, present, woven into who I had become. Calm wasn't something I was trying to find. It was something I was remembering how to allow. That awareness changed the way I looked at my childhood, not as a series of events, but as a collection of sensations that had quietly shaped me. I stopped asking what happened and started asking how things felt, and in doing so, that familiar calm surfaced again, steady and unmistakable. I thought about how rarely children are given spaces that don't ask them to perform. So much of growing up involves learning how to respond correctly, how to behave, how to meet expectations that are often unspoken. That program had asked none of that from me. It had simply met me where I was. I began to understand how powerful that meeting had been. Being addressed directly, but gently. Being acknowledged without being evaluated. Being told, again and again, that feelings were allowed to exist without needing to be fixed. Those messages sink deeper than instructions ever could. At the time, I hadn't questioned why it felt different. I assumed that was just how adults spoke when they cared. I didn't know that care often gets rushed, diluted, or lost entirely once the world decides speed matters more. Remembering that contrast brought a quiet sadness, not heavy, but real. Not grief for the past, but awareness of how much gentleness had slowly disappeared from everyday life. The calm that once felt normal had become something rare, even precious. I noticed how often people now confuse urgency with importance. How quickly conversations move past feelings, toward solutions. How little space is left for simply being heard. That realization made those early experiences feel even more significant. I realized that what protected me wasn't just the program itself, but the permission it gave me to feel without explanation. That permission followed me into adulthood, even when I forgot where it came from. It shaped how I listened, how I responded, how I treated my own emotions. There were moments when I resisted that softness, afraid it made me vulnerable. The world doesn't always reward gentleness, but over time, I learned that what feels soft can also be strong. That calm can hold more than intensity ever could. The memory of those afternoons became something I returned to, not to escape the present, but to understand it, to remind myself that slowness once existed naturally, without needing justification. That understanding brought clarity. The calm I valued wasn't accidental. It had been modeled, repeated, offered consistently until it became familiar. And familiarity, I realized, is one of the most powerful forms of protection. I didn't know it then, but those quiet lessons had prepared me for a world that would eventually move too fast. They gave me something steady to return to, even when everything else felt unbalanced. As that understanding settled, I became more aware of how often I had underestimated the impact of small, steady influences. I had spent years looking for turning points, for moments that clearly explained who I was and why. I hadn't considered that the most important shaping forces might have been quiet, repetitive, almost invisible. Those afternoons didn't stand out because something happened. They stood out because nothing demanded anything from me. In a life where attention was often pulled outward, that absence of demand was a gift I didn't know how to name at the time. It allowed me to exist without bracing myself. I thought about how many children grow up without ever experiencing that kind of emotional steadiness. How often they are asked to grow resilient, instead of being given places where resilience isn't required. The realization deepened my appreciation for what I had received, even if it came from an unexpected place. I began to see how that early experience had influenced the way I reacted to conflict later in life. My instinct was often to slow things down rather than escalate them, to pause instead of pushing forward, to listen before responding. These tendencies hadn't appeared out of nowhere. They had been rehearsed quietly, long ago. There were moments when this put me out of step with the world around me. People expected quick answers, decisive reactions, visible confidence. My calm sometimes read as hesitation. My patience was occasionally mistaken for indifference. For a long time, I wondered if I needed to change. Remembering those afternoons helped me understand that what felt different wasn't wrong. It was simply shaped by a different set of values. Values that prioritized presence over performance, care over control, and understanding over speed. Those values had been introduced gently, not imposed. I noticed how my body responded when I honored that rhythm, how tension eased when I allowed pauses, how clarity emerged when I stopped forcing decisions. Waiting, once something I tolerated, began to feel like something I could trust again. That shift didn't make life slower in a practical sense. Responsibilities remained. Time moved on, but my relationship with time softened. I stopped treating every delay as an obstacle, and started seeing some of them as invitations to breathe. The more I allowed that, the more familiar it felt, as if I were returning to a way of being that had always been there, waiting patiently beneath layers of urgency. The calm wasn't new, it was remembered. I understood then that the protection I had received wasn't limited to childhood. It had planted a reference point, a quiet internal guide that I could still access. Even now, even after everything had changed. And in recognizing that, I felt a sense of continuity, a line connecting who I had been, who I was, and who I was becoming, all shaped, in part, by a gentle presence that once spoke softly from a television screen, and taught me how to feel safe without ever saying the word. As I reflected on all of this, I realized how rarely we stop to ask what actually shaped us. We tend to credit big events, dramatic moments, visible turning points, but the truth is that most of who we become is formed quietly, through repetition, tone, and presence, through what we experience over and over without noticing. That realization made those afternoons feel even more meaningful. They weren't dramatic, they weren't intense. They didn't announce themselves as important, and yet, they offered something many environments did not: emotional steadiness without conditions. That steadiness became a reference point I would carry forward unconsciously. I began to notice how often, as an adult, I tried to recreate that feeling for others. The way I slowed my voice when someone seemed overwhelmed. The way I allowed silence instead of rushing to fill it. The way I chose gentleness even when urgency felt expected. I hadn't learned those things formally. They had been modeled for me. There was something deeply human about that modeling. No instructions, no explanations. Just consistent behavior that said, without words, that it was okay to be exactly where you were. That message doesn't fade easily once it has been felt. I wondered how different my experience might have been without that quiet influence. How much harder it would have been to recognize calm later in life, if I hadn't known it early. You can't long for what you've never felt. You can't seek safety if you don't know what it feels like. That thought brought gratitude, but also responsibility. A sense that what we offer others, especially children, matters even when it seems insignificant. The tone we use, the pace we choose, the way we respond to emotion, these things teach far more than we realize. I noticed how much the world had changed since those days. How little room there now is for slowness without justification. How often calm is treated as something to be earned, rather than something to be given. That shift made those early experiences feel even more precious. It also made me aware of how easy it is to dismiss the impact of children's spaces, children's programming, children's voices. We often underestimate how deeply they register what they feel, even when they can't explain it, especially then. That program hadn't tried to be extraordinary. It hadn't tried to impress. It had simply shown up, gently and consistently, trusting that this was enough, and it was, more than enough. Understanding that changed the way I remembered my childhood. It wasn't just something I survived or moved through. It was something that quietly supported me, even when I didn't know I needed support at all. As I sat with that understanding, I began to feel a different kind of gratitude, one that didn't rush toward emotion, but stayed steady and quiet. Gratitude for something that had never demanded recognition, never asked to be thanked, and yet had offered so much simply by being present. I thought about how easily we overlook what doesn't shout for attention. How quickly we move past the things that feel calm, because they don't trigger urgency or excitement. That program had lived in that overlooked space, doing its work without noise, without spectacle. It made me wonder how many other gentle influences had shaped me in similar ways. How many moments of steadiness had passed unnoticed, only to reveal their importance much later. The realization softened my view of the past, turning what once felt ordinary into something quietly meaningful. I noticed how this reflection changed my relationship with memory itself. I stopped searching only for dramatic moments and began honoring the subtle ones. The afternoons that didn't stand out, the routines that felt repetitive, the presences that stayed the same. Those were the places where something lasting had been built. There was comfort in knowing that protection doesn't always come in obvious forms. Sometimes it arrives as patience, as consistency, as a voice that never rushes you, even when the world around you does. That kind of protection doesn't leave scars or stories of survival. It leaves steadiness. I began to see that calm is not passive. It requires intention to offer and courage to maintain. In a world that rewards speed and reaction, choosing gentleness is a quiet act of resistance. One that doesn't seek credit, but changes things anyway. That realization reframed how I thought about influence. It isn't always the loudest voices that shape us most deeply. Sometimes it's the ones that speak softly, trustingly, believing that what they offer is enough. Often, they're right. I carried that thought with me, feeling its weight settle slowly. It didn't demand action. It didn't insist on resolution. It simply asked to be remembered, honored for what it had been, even if it was no longer present. The memory of those afternoons no longer felt distant or faded. It felt integrated, woven into how I understood myself and the world. Not as nostalgia, but as context, as explanation. And in that quiet integration, I felt something close to peace. The kind that comes not from answers, but from understanding where certain parts of you began, and why they still matter now. By the time I reached this point in the remembering, I understood that the story was never really about a television show. It was about what surrounded it, what it held together, and what it quietly made possible. The screen was just the doorway. The feeling was the place I kept returning to. I thought about how many times I had searched for calm later in life, assuming it was something I needed to build from scratch. I tried routines, habits, explanations, all in an effort to recreate something I thought I had lost. Only now did I see that calm had been introduced to me early, long before I knew how to ask for it. That realization shifted something deep inside me. It softened the urgency I often felt to fix myself or move faster. I didn't need to become calm. I needed to remember it, to recognize it when it appeared, and allow it to stay instead of pushing it aside. I began to notice how often that remembered calm surfaced in unexpected moments, in a quiet conversation, in a pause that wasn't rushed, in the presence of someone who didn't demand anything from me. Each time, my body responded first, relaxing before my mind could explain why. It made me wonder how many of us carry similar memories without realizing it. How many people learned what safety felt like from small, consistent experiences that never seemed important enough to name. Those memories don't fade, they wait. I also understood that the absence of that program wasn't just about something ending. It marked a shift in the world, a movement away from patience, toward stimulation, away from gentleness, toward speed. The sadness I felt wasn't just personal, it was collective. Still, there was comfort in knowing that what had protected me once hadn't disappeared completely. It lived on in my preferences, my instincts, my reactions. It influenced how I listened, how I spoke, how I chose to show up for others. That awareness brought a quiet responsibility, to offer that same steadiness when I could, to slow my voice when someone seemed overwhelmed, to create small spaces where nothing needed to be solved immediately. Protection, I realized, can be passed on without ceremony. The memory no longer felt like something locked in the past. It felt active, relevant, alive in the present. A reminder that calm doesn't have to be dramatic to be powerful. It just has to be consistent. I didn't know, as a child, that I was being protected. I only knew that something felt right. It took years to understand why. And now that I do, I carry that understanding with me, quietly grateful for a presence that once spoke softly and taught me how to feel safe without ever saying it out loud. The story doesn't end there. It continues in every moment where I choose patience over urgency, gentleness over reaction, remembrance over forgetting. As I moved forward with that understanding, I began to see how easy it is to underestimate what children absorb when no one is trying to teach them anything. We tend to believe lessons require structure, explanation, and intention. But some of the deepest lessons arrive quietly, through tone, rhythm, and repetition, settling in places words never reach. I thought about how different my internal world might have been without that steady reference point. How easily chaos can feel normal when calm is never modeled. How quickly urgency can become the default when nothing ever slows down. That realization gave me compassion for versions of myself that had struggled later, not because they were broken, but because they were searching for something they once knew. There was a tenderness in recognizing that the calm I valued wasn't a personality trait. It wasn't something I had invented. It had been offered to me, patiently, until it became familiar enough to feel like my own. That distinction mattered. It meant I wasn't failing when the world felt too loud. I was remembering what quiet felt like. I noticed how often I now gravitated toward environments that carried that same steadiness. Places where people listened without interrupting, where silence wasn't awkward, where time wasn't treated as an enemy. Those spaces felt immediately recognizable, as if my body knew them before my mind did. This awareness changed how I interpreted discomfort. Instead of seeing restlessness as weakness, I began to see it as a signal, a reminder that my system was asking for something it had once received naturally. Calm wasn't indulgent, it was necessary. I also began to see how rare it had become to offer that kind of presence to others. The pace of life leaves little room for it, yet when it does appear, people respond instantly. Shoulders drop, voices soften, breathing slows. The body recognizes safety, even when the mind hasn't named it yet. That made me realize how powerful small choices can be. Choosing to slow down a conversation, choosing not to rush a response, choosing to be consistent rather than impressive. These choices don't draw attention, but they leave a lasting impression. The program that once offered me that experience never framed itself as extraordinary. It trusted that gentleness was enough. In a world increasingly driven by stimulation, that trust feels almost radical now. I carry that lesson with me, not as nostalgia, but as guidance. A reminder that calm doesn't need to announce itself to matter. It simply needs to be present, steady, and willing to stay. As this reflection continued to unfold, I found myself thinking less about the past and more about what it had quietly prepared me for. The calm I had known early on hadn't insulated me from difficulty. It hadn't prevented pain or confusion. What it had done was give me a reference, a way to recognize when something felt grounding and when it didn't. That reference became invaluable later in life, when noise and urgency tried to pass themselves off as normal. I could feel, even without clear reasons, when something was out of alignment. My body knew the difference between stimulation and safety, between distraction and presence, long before my mind caught up. I realized that this is how protection often works. It doesn't stop the world from being difficult. It teaches you how to move through difficulty without losing yourself completely. It gives you an internal place to return to when external conditions become overwhelming. There were moments when I doubted that internal compass, when I wondered if I was simply avoiding challenge or responsibility. But over time, I learned to trust what settled me instead of what drained me. Calm didn't make me passive, it made me resilient. I also noticed how this understanding softened my expectations of others. I became more aware that not everyone had been shown what safety feels like early on, that patience, slowness, and gentleness might feel unfamiliar or even uncomfortable to some people. That awareness brought empathy instead of judgment. The more I honored that early lesson, the more intentional my choices became. I stopped measuring success only by speed or output. I paid attention to sustainability, to how things felt over time. Calm revealed itself not as a luxury, but as a foundation. I understood then that what I had received wasn't something tied to a specific era or program. It was a human need, expressed through a particular form. The form faded, but the need remained, and so did the memory of how it had once been met. That realization reframed the sadness I felt about its absence. It wasn't just loss, it was invitation. An invitation to carry forward what had been offered to me, to embody it when possible, to keep it alive in small, ordinary ways. The protection I hadn't recognized as a child now felt active again, not because the world had slowed down, but because I had learned how to slow myself, and in doing so, I felt connected not only to who I was, but to who I had always been becoming. In the end, what stays with me most is not the memory of the program itself, but the feeling it left behind. A feeling that didn't demand explanation, didn't require proof, didn't ask to be justified. It simply existed, steady and reassuring, shaping me quietly while I wasn't looking. I understand now that this is how some of the most important things enter our lives. They don't arrive loudly, they don't announce their purpose, they settle in gently, repeating themselves until they feel like part of us. Only later do we realize how much they held together. As a child, I couldn't have said that something was protecting me. I didn't have the language or the awareness for that. I only knew how my body felt in those moments, how my breathing slowed, how my thoughts softened, how the world felt a little less sharp for a while. As an adult, I see that protection clearly, not as something dramatic, but as something deeply practical. It gave me a sense of what calm feels like so I could recognize it again. It gave me permission to value gentleness in a world that often overlooks it. The sadness I feel isn't only about what ended, it's about how rare that kind of presence has become, how unusual it now seems to move slowly, to speak carefully, to allow silence without rushing to fill it. What once felt normal now feels almost revolutionary. Still, there is comfort in knowing that nothing truly learned through feeling is ever lost. It waits, it resurfaces, it guides us back when we are ready to notice it again. The calm that once protected me didn't disappear. It became part of who I am. This story, like the others, isn't meant to pull us backward. It's meant to help us recognize what mattered before we knew how to name it. To remember a time when calm was present in everyday life, quietly doing its work while we went on growing. If this memory found you in a quiet moment, or reminded you of something you once felt without understanding it, you're not alone. These stories exist to hold space for that remembering. To pause together, even briefly, in a world that rarely slows down. You're welcome to stay here for more of them. To return whenever you need a moment of calm. And to remember with me, a world where gentleness was present, protecting us in ways we only understand now.